Well, let's turn our attention to the coastal plain. Now, the coastal plain begins in the south, way down at a wadi called the Wadi El Arish, just slightly off the bottom of our map, and extends all the way up to where you see the upper arrow pointing. It's a place called Rosh HaNikra, where the mountains come right out to the water, virtually blocking the coastal plain. There's no more coastal plain there. In fact, travel can't continue farther north, and that serves as a natural border. In fact, that's the border between the modern state of Israel and Lebanon today. Now, here we're kind of in the southern part, the coastal plain in the area of the Philistines, and this is one of their cities, Ashkelon. It's the ancient Tel, and it kind of has a semicircular shape. It's like a sea facing out to the Mediterranean Sea. You can kind of see some of the embankments there, the outline of the ancient city. So this is the area where the Philistines would have lived. Now we've traveled all the way up to the northernmost part of Israel, and that place called Rosh HaNikra. And we're looking pretty much due south down the coast, so you can see with the Mediterranean Sea on the right, quite flat, a lot of sand, not a lot of trees. So this is what the coastal plain looks like. Now we've moved all the way down the coast at a familiar site of Joppa. This is the port where Jonah got on the ship to head to Tarshish to flee from the Lord, didn't want to go to Nineveh. And so we are now looking out over the modern city of Tel Aviv from the ancient site of Joppa. Now there in Joppa is a modern port. Joppa really wasn't well equipped as a natural port. They did have ships that would go out from there in the ancient times, but in modern times they've built an artificial harbor because there's really no natural harbor there. In fact, Israel has very few natural harbors. There's one up in the area of Akko in the farther north, a nice natural cove that's good for protection for ships. But this could explain why Israel really didn't have much of a seafaring community in its history. Yeah, every once in a while they would build ships and do things, but not like the Greeks or other civilizations. They really weren't a seafaring people for the most part. And that's due to their geography. They just didn't have a good area for ports. Well, the coastal plain is important because of the international coastal highway that transverses it. And so travel coming up from Egypt, going up to Mesopotamia would go along this route, and it meets up at Damascus with the King's Highway and goes on to places like Assyria and Babylon. So the coastal plain was a great area for travel, being a wide, broad plain. It's easy to travel there. In fact, the modern highway goes up and down north-south in Israel along the coastal plain. You know why hassle with going up and down the mountains when you can just travel along the coastal plain? It's a lot easier. Well, this is where the Philistines lived, on the coastal plain. This is a picture of a Philistine soldier, and you might notice his hat, and I kind of jokingly call this the inverted scrub brush hat. Now, it's really not a scrub brush, but it kind of looks like one. And we know, really, that the Philistines used to wear this because on the walls of one of the buildings down in Egypt, they've inscribed pictures of the Philistines on the walls. And so we see they're wearing the same type of headdress there. And it's actually made of feathers. So it's a feathered hairdress that the Philistines would wear. Now the Philistines had pretty high technology. They had iron technology, well in advance of the Israelites, and they also had chariot technology, which worked very well on the open plain. And this is a papyrus of an Egyptian chariot, because we have almost no remains of Philistine chariots or pictures of Philistine chariots, but it would have been quite similar to this lightweight Egyptian chariot here. And so the Philistines could use these chariots. They worked well on the broad coastal plain, and it enabled them to attack quickly and move out of the range of their enemies should their enemies retaliate. So chariots were good for that, kind of a strike and run strategy. Where did the Philistines come from? They were really not native to Canaan, and they came from the area of Greece, the Aegean Sea, and there was a huge wave of migration around 1200 BC. Scholars call the Philistines' ancestors the Sea Peoples because they came by way of the sea. They're called that in some Egyptian documents. And so they migrated from Greece and the Aegean Sea. Some settled in Crete, Cyprus, northern Egypt, and also in Canaan, or the land of Israel. They brought their religion with them. This is an artist's depiction of a temple that was excavated at one of the Philistine cities of Ekron. And we can see here in the excavation slide, in the center are some stands with a bowl on top. Those would have been for burning incense. So the Philistines had their own form of worship and their own idols. This is a rather large idol because you can see on the left is a meter stick, and so this idol is actually bigger than a meter, and the mold used to make that idol is on the right. So they would put the material inside the mold, and later out would pop the idol. The fields in the coastal plain were quite fertile. The soil there is good. It gets a decent amount of rainfall. So it was a very desirable place to live. And so the Philistines liked living there. Even to this day, there's good harvest gained in the coastal plain. Well, if we were to go to the extreme northern part of Israel, at a place called Rosh HaNikra, that's where the coastal plain stops. The mountains come right out to the sea, and you really can't travel easily by foot farther north. You kind of have to go around this mountain range, and so the coastal plain ends there in the north. This is what it looks like as you look up the coast there at Rosh HaNikra. The hills descend right down into the Mediterranean Sea, making a natural barrier between Israel and the nations to the north today, which would be Lebanon. As we move a little farther south from Rosh HaNikra in the far north, we come to the plain of Akko. And we're seeing the city of Haifa in the foreground, looking out across that cove there of the Mediterranean Sea on the right. That part of the valley is going to join up with the Jezreel Valley. We'll be looking at that a little while later. So we call this area the plain of Akko because of the main city there. Moving farther south from the plain of Akko, we come to the plain of Sharon. And the plain of Sharon begins in the north, where the Carmel mountain range comes right out to the coast. And then you can see how the coastal plain there is pretty flat and extends down from the Carmel range to where we're looking at this time. So this would be the Sharon plain. That area is quite fertile today. In biblical times, it was kind of swampy, not that good for agriculture, but it's been drained and it's very good for agricultural nowadays, especially citrus fruit grows very well there. They've perfected a technique to grow citrus there. Well, a city called Aphek is very important in the coastal plain because that's right along the International Coastal Highway, but just to the west of Aphek, the area is quite swampy. It's where the Yarkon River begins, and so it flows out to the west to the Mediterranean Sea. So the International Coastal Highway kind of has two branches before that, and they converge at Aphek, avoiding the wet, swampy area to the west. And so that area of Aphek is very important because of the way the terrain narrows the highway down to kind of like one lane. If we look at 1 Samuel 4:1, it says there, "Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped beside Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped in Aphek." So a battle is about to ensue between the Israelites and the Philistines, and so the Philistines are camped at that very strategic city of Aphek. And here we see in the center of the slide is an ancient fort, a Turkish fort, about 500 years old. So we can see that even in that time period, this place was considered to be very strategic enough to build a fort there. And we can see the lake behind it. That's the headwaters of the Yarkon River. And so to the west of that, you want to avoid that as you're traveling north and south. You want to stay a little bit to the east, and that's why the site of Aphek was so important to control that area. Isaiah 42:6 says, "I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you, and I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations." So it was God's plan for his people to be a light to the nations, and he put them right on the highway, right? This is right on the Intercoastal Highway. We have travelers traveling internationally. And back in Genesis, God said, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God's intention was that Israel would be a light to the nations, those nations passing through her borders, and that Israel would be a blessing to those nations.